I'll pass over now to our honorary fellow, Professor Francis Pope. In case you can't read the writing, I will read some of it out, but I won't read the whole page. So Professor Pope is an expert on the causes and effects of air pollution, drawing together insight from a multidisciplinary perspective to understand how air pollution affects human health and how it relates to urban development. He currently has active projects in the UK, Europe, Africa, and India, through which he interacts with various stakeholders, including academics, international, government and city authorities, charities, and UN bodies. He's based at the University of Birmingham. Some of you might be aware of Francis' work already. And today, Francis is going to cover a presentation on air pollution sensors, the state of play and future direction for both indoor and outdoor measurements, which will be possibly more exciting than some of the slides that I presented, and probably definitely more colourful as well. So Francis, if I can pass over to yourself, I'll stop sharing and we'll switch presentations.
Brilliant, excellent. Okay, so thanks a lot. So I've been given about half an hour, 35 minutes to talk to you today about air pollution sensors. But first of all, yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the honorary fellowship. I always tell my students and all the master's students, actually, I really enjoy interacting with the IAQM, and it's one of the highlights of the year going to your conference. And, you know, I think it gives us academics, you know, that sense of what actually is useful. So certainly I find it certainly very useful for myself, but I'll touch on these points as I go through. So this is very much my point of view, and I'll be using examples from my group, but clearly sensors have been around for over a decade now. And in some ways they're still very much the dream of the future, but in some ways they are becoming much more mainstream. So I'll try and highlight where I think they're ready and where maybe the dream is still yet to be realized as we go through. So yeah, let's crack on. So I'll just have a few acknowledgements first. As ever, when you get the professor talking, you know, he's really just talking about what people in his group have been up to. So I should, in particular, Demetrius has been doing a lot of the source apportionment work in my group. Ajit Singh did a lot of the work getting the sensors working in the first place. Sophie's done a lot of work around the bioaerosols. Robin Price is an artist, albeit one with a PhD in experimental physics, and that's some of the public engagement stuff I'll talk about at the end. Aranik was a visiting scholar from Italy. He's done a lot of the machine learning stuff. And then the last two I think is particularly relevant here, actually. So we have loads of good links with IAQM and the consultancies that represent it. So Gordon Allison at Duscan, we've been doing an awful lot of work around the low-cost source apportionment with. And Owain Rose, who's newly out of the masters here in Birmingham, is now taking up a job of air and acoustic consultants, needed a lot of the indoor work I'll talk about. The funding's from these guys at the bottom. But just I think it's worth pointing out, and one of the nice things of interacting with IAQM is these links with people like Duscan and air and acoustic consultants. And if you haven't realized it already, like academia, we're getting far more judged on our impact in the real world than we ever used to. So it's not just about papers and conferences anymore. The metrics and drivers of our success are very much married to us doing work in the real world of consultancies, etc. So if I do have a role with this honorary fellowship, I'd be very happy to kind of signpost, if you're interested, signpost to academics who might be interested in the work that you're doing as well. Not just from the University of Birmingham, of course. The University of Birmingham is the best university in the world, but you know, clearly I'm well linked with the other universities. So I'll be very happy to act as that conduit if that's useful. So hopefully this slide is singing to the choir. I'm sure everyone in this room knows all about every single fact on here, but I think it's always worth emphasizing it. And Chris mentioned this at the start, that it is boom time in air pollution at the moment, which is great for us and for you. But the reason it's boom time is because air pollution is this major problem. So it causes this range of adverse effects upon human health. And it's this globally leading environmental risk factor. So it's causing 5 to 7 million premature deaths per year, as an estimate. In the UK, that's somewhere between 30 and 40,000 premature deaths per year. So leading environmental risk factor in the UK, as well as other places. And on top of those premature deaths, of course, there's many more cases of morbidities. So mechanisms that affects our respiratory system, cardiovascular system, it's a carcinogen. And interestingly, and I think this will interact with, again, IAQM increasingly so, it's this effects on cognition and mental health is increasingly being recognised. And on one of Chris's slides earlier, he highlighted the need for the IAQM to think more about the interactions with indoor environments. And so if we're thinking about work environments or study environments, whether that's schools or colleges, actually, if there is this short-term cognitive effect of air pollution upon our performance, then the UK wanting to be this leading tech country, then, you know, potentially this is very important. So I think this is very much a growth area. Again, this is very much singing to the choir. So, but this is just really to remind me that I'm talking predominantly about particulate matter air pollution today. And there are other air pollutants, gases, your NO, your NOxes, NO and NO2, carbon monoxide, etc., etc. Now, the reason I'm going to focus on particulate matter is for two reasons, really. One of which is it's the most important air pollutant in the UK. That's where those premature deaths come from. But secondly, actually in the sensor space, the sensors are now pretty good at measuring particulate matter. You know, so you can get MCerts, they've been certified. And so within certain tolerances, the sensors work very well. Whereas if we go to the gas sensors, there's good data you can get out of them, there's good reports, but actually in terms of that, is there a certification? No, there isn't yet. So it's not as far along the line as maybe the particulate matter sensors are. And the other bit I wanted to point out, so the eagle-eyed amongst you would recognise that this is the old WHO recommendation before 2021. And so this was one of the points I wanted to make. So before 2021 in the UK, we could actually be reasonably comfortable that we were hitting most of the time, unless you're on Marylebone Road in London or some of the more polluted bits of Birmingham, for example, we were within these recommendations. But as of 2021, they became much more strict. Remember, these are just advisory. These aren't, there's no regulatory aspects to these WHO limits. But actually, in the UK, now we really are struggling to hit some of these, and we will be for many years. So as part of the IAQM, I can assure you're all in jobs for the time being, so this is where the health effects are. But it shows that we still have a lot more work to do. And I think the sensors will have a big part to play within there. Okay, so this is just touching on the cognitive side again. So these are just a few headlines I pulled out. So, is air pollution making you dumb? The link between air pollution and our general health is well proven. Large-scale research from China suggests that it may be affecting our brains too. Air pollution rots our brains. Is that why we don't do anything about it? Pollution may dim thinking skills, etc. So I really think this is going to be a major area, and where companies will start paying good money to have good air quality within their working environments, and maybe even pay for it to have good environments within our own homes. So I think there's going to be lots more indoor work here as well as on public transport and other places where we interact with high levels of air pollution. Okay, so within the UK, so before we get onto the sensors, we have this regulatory air quality monitoring network. So as you all know, I'm sure, we have this AURN network. So currently 171 sites, and it's been running a long time. The first site was up and running in 1972. Not many sites at that point, but as we go forward, more and more come on. So actually, compared to the rest of the world, we're doing really well. You know, really, we are lucky to have the gold standard in regulatory monitoring sites in the UK. And so since we have the gold standard, then why do we need these sensors? And I guess I've already hinted at some places like indoors, where obviously we don't have AURN sites indoors. But again, if we look at this map, whilst there's 171 sites, there's 66 million people in the UK. So if we divided 66 by 171, so what's that? We've got one site per 330,000 people or so, if I've done the maths correct. But either way, we don't have lots of information at high levels. Most major towns, most major cities now have one site, but obviously there can be a lot of variation within one major town, one major city. Okay, so what was the promise of air quality sensors? So on the left-hand side, I've got the advantages. So On the advantages side, obviously they're cheap on the whole. And so, really, if you go onto Amazon now, you can buy a quite reasonable particle sensor. You can buy the plant tower, what's it, the SPS 30, and about 30 quid, 20 quid. I think it gives very, very reasonable output. So certainly that capital expenditure, that capex side of it, they are cheap. And on the operating side, the OPEX operating expenses, they can be cheap as well. I mean, it's a bugbear of mine if I'm paying a research fellow to do a low-cost sensor project, that's costing me a huge amount of money. And I think that's probably routinely the case. So it's not always that they're cheap, but there is this potential for them to be really cheap. Another obvious point is they're small in size and small in weight. They have low power requirements. And so that means you can start using them with batteries. Obviously, you really can have them off-grid. And at some level, not always the case, but at some level, there's low technical expertise required. So that's what the sensors brought to the game. And of course, that brought a whole new bunch of applications, which we'll go through and look at in this talk. So the first two are this kind of greater spatial resolution, greater temporal resolution, and this brought this neologism, this hyperlocal measurements, which we've all heard of now. So whereas the AURN, maybe in Birmingham, we've got 5 AURN sites, we could now have a grid of sensors, thousands maybe, and we really get that hyperlocal measurement. We can now start thinking about mobile devices. We can start putting them on people. We can start putting them on vehicles. Maybe we could start creating a big drone army which can raster itself across the UK and really measure like every square inch. We can have sacrificial devices. So I've done some work with the volcanologists out of the University of Leeds, people like Evgeny Ilinsky. And so the volcanologists really are the Indiana Jones of the science world. They're the ones who want to be hanging off helicopters, putting their devices into the mouth of volcanoes. And of course, if you're doing that, then you might drop them. So you really do need to have devices which are cheap and sacrificial at that point. We can start to think about multiple pollutant measurements, so combining sensors together, and I'll talk about that a little bit. We can talk about doing indoor monitoring, and I'll have some examples there. Again, back in the days where your kit was the size of my desk, it weighed half a ton, it cost a lot of money, and the pumps on it meant it would suck all the air out of the room in 2 minutes. So, it really wasn't viable to do indoor monitoring, but now you can. You can combine with other devices. So other sensors, whether that's things like radar sensors to understand how movement interacts with air pollution, or maybe you're interested in things like noise sensors, how other pollutants have similar sources to air pollution. And then we can move into kind of digital twins. And then I won't talk about that today, but then we can also think about public outreach and citizen science. And I'll have a few examples of this at the end. And again, now that these things cost 10, 20 quid potentially, then really you can start putting these in every school, and people are starting to do this. So if you're going out to buy some low-cost sensors, what are the things you should consider? Obvious stuff, but I think this is a useful list to go through. So what air pollutants are you interested in, and how good is the sensor at that? And as I hinted at or said earlier, so I reckon the particulate matter air pollution ones are good now. The gases, the jury's much less sure on, I would say. What's the cost, and really thinking about the difference between capex and opex there. Power, communications, what support, etc., etc. So the talk's not about that today, but I think this is a useful way to think about it as we go through. So this slide was from Sophie. So this is for the bioaerosols project we're doing, but I think this is a useful figure. So this greater spatial resolution. So this is our example city. She was worried about bioaerosols, things like spore and fungal spores and pollen and things like that. But it would work just as well for pollution. So we've got multiple sources in our city. So we've got our cornfield here on the outskirts, releasing wheat spores, fungal spores associated with wheat into there. We've got trees and their pollen. We've got some pollution from the factories. We've got vehicles. We've got some biocomposting site over here. And essentially, if we only have that one regulatory site, in the middle of town. Yes, it's better than not having a regulatory site. Yes, it's great that we've got this gold standard in the middle of our city, but clearly the gradient of our bioaerosols or air pollution is going to be greatly varied as we go across the city. So we'd like to know if we're worried about people's exposure. So say the people on the left-hand side of the city, do they get the same exposure as people on the right-hand side, for a simple example? We have no idea if all we're doing is measuring in the middle. So the dream really of low-cost sensors, I guess, is this second picture. So now we still have the gold standard in the middle, but now we've supplemented it with sensors around. So we've put static mode nodes throughout the city. We've even got some on drones going through. We've got them on top of buildings. We've got them inside buildings. And actually, for a relatively modest increase in cost, we've got far more information and we can start really worrying about what's people's exposures. So if I'm commuting from this house, I've got this much exposure during my time at the house, and maybe I'm commuting over to this factory, so I get that much exposure from my commute, and then I've got this exposure in the factory, and then I go back home. We can really start using this information to have a better idea, a personalized exposure to air pollution. So that's kind of the dream. And lots of people and lots of groups have started to realize this over the years. So some famous examples, there's the Breathe London network, which has been run by Imperial College in London. So that's been very effective in looking at PM2.5 and NO2 throughout the city. But they're not the only game in town. Lots of international work. The guys at IIT Kanpur in India is doing some really, really nice work in this space at the moment. I think really leading the way in which you can use machine learning with these sensors. And then within Africa, really nice network there by Airquo. And I think one of the nice things about the relative low cost of these networks is it's actually bringing these countries and teams that we might not have expected to see being at the forefront of the science. Actually, they are, they're leading the way in many cases, which is great to see. Okay, so we've done hyperlocal stuff, so we can also do mobile measurements. So this is an example of some of my work in Africa. So where we instrumented up the back of these motorbike taxis, so these boda bodas. So this is the dominant form of public transport in Kampala. So we put some instruments on the back of these, and you can start to map out what the exposure, what their concentrations look like as we go through the city. Just a snapshot, of course, but if you do this for long enough, then you can start to build up these histograms using the American EPA Air Quality Index about how much time the motorbike riders and passengers were in different exposures here. And we can do this there. We can do a similar study here showing Ethiopia. And this now we're looking on buses in vehicles. So just an example, similar sort of idea. So what does the exposure look like? And I think, there's clear room for really, these were just proof of principle type studies, but I think we can now think to expand this. And DPD were doing this. I haven't heard much about this for a little while, but when I heard about this, and I talked to them a few times, I really thought this was the solution going forward, how to really get lots of excellent data for a whole city. So DPD, so this logistics fleet, delivering your Amazon parcels, etc. They collaborated with Polytrack, a French company, to put these sensors on the top of their vans. So as they drive around the city, and they really do go everywhere, and then you can start to build up that hyperlocal measurement. I haven't heard much from them in a while, so I don't know if they're still running, but hopefully, if they've stopped, hopefully someone would be able to crack this, because I think this is the way. And maybe the question here is, what's in it for DPD? I guess there's certainly a corporate social responsibility aspect to it, but whether they can then get to sell the data to the DEFRA network, for example, whether there's still lacking that business case there for why we want these sensors. But hopefully something like this could become routine, because I think that will give us a lot of really, really useful information for the cities. Okay, so a little bit about indoor measurements. Again, other work around, but this is one example from my group. And this was work which was done by Owain Rose, who's just gone to work for air and noise quality consultants in Birmingham. So our loss is their gain. So he did this really nice study during his master's in Birmingham, where he looked at a school in South Wales. in Cardiff, and he measured the air pollution in 3 different classrooms. So classroom 1 was religious education, so no real expected sources of air pollution in there other than the pupils being in there, moving around and resuspension of dust, maybe the odd whiff of incense potentially, with it being RE. Classroom 2 is in English. Again, you wouldn't really expect any additional sources in there. And then classroom 3 was cooking, so obviously you might expect to see some combustion sources in there. So we can see up here, so this is just the PM1, PM2.5 and PM10 time series, and Owen came up with this really nice design of the experiment. So he only did 2 weeks worth of monitoring, but what he did, which was very cute, I thought, was he monitored for 1 week during term time, and then the next week was half term. So what you can see is, if we look in the PM10 in particular, you can see this very clear diurnal pattern in the week before half term. We then get to the weekend, and then during the half term period, like, the air pollution is pretty much turned off. So really nice design in there. And I'll come back to this study when we look at the source apportionment type stuff. And then we've talked about hyperlocal monitoring. And again, depending on how hyperlocal you want to make your monitoring, we can then start to have people walking around with air pollution sensors actually in their backpacks. Again, there's been really nice work out of Imperial College, but this is work that we've been doing in Birmingham. This is Demetrius's work. And so what he did was he combined both static and mobile measurements. We looked at the Selly Oak area of Birmingham. So this is Studentville, to the south of the university up here. And the stars, the stars represent where we had static sites, still low-cost sensor sites, but static. And the nice thing about having static sites is you get excellent temporal information. So you get the information for the same site throughout time. And then we employed various students just to go about their daily business, but as they walked on and off campus, we got information about these different roads. And the plot on the bottom right is just a composite of some of their measurements as they walked around, with the heat map with the more yellow color being the higher the pollution. And so you can start to get this really hyperlocal monitoring if you start bringing in these mobile measurements as well. And again, we'll return to this when I start talking about source apportionment in a few minutes' time. Well, maybe now. So I've talked to the IAQM before about this, but maybe not to everyone in the room. And so low-cost sensors, I think it's clear that they really have, there's been a paradigm shift in the monitoring of air pollution. So the first part of air quality management is you have to know how much air pollution there is there. And clearly low-cost sensors have completely revolutionized this there. We can measure in far more places. We can measure at much higher resolution. But the second step in air quality management is that apportionment. So yes, we can measure how much air pollution there is, but where does it come from? So successful air quality management and control not only requires the measurement of air pollution levels, but it also requires information on the sources and their relative importance. And without this critical targeted information, it's difficult to plan and enact control measures with which to reduce air pollution. So I think this, as far as I'm concerned, I think this is the next step where low-cost sensors can really make a big difference, is in this source apportionment. So my group's looking at this. There's other groups. There's a good group in India are looking at this, and a few American groups as well. But I think there's going to be a lot of movement in here, and hopefully this will relatively rapidly pass on to you guys in more consultancy type roles. So I think, I'm sure, much like me, you must get emails kind of every other week about something along the lines of, my neighbour's chimneys, smoke is coming into my room, what can I do about it? And the truth is, there's not a lot you can do about it, because it's very difficult to measure and apportion the pollution and the blame because of it. And so the source apportionment approaches could do it, but beforehand, it was a very expensive way to do it. But if we can move that source apportionment into this sensor type territory, then I think really that local councils and similar can have that ability to actually say, well, you're causing the air pollution, so you have to resolve it. So I hope to see movement in this direction shortly. So the way we do the source apportionment is we use the size distribution of particles. And this requires a relatively expensive low-cost sensor. So this is using sensors kind of about £300 as opposed to, you know, the £10 ones off Amazon I was talking about earlier. But what these ones do is they measure the size distribution of the particles. And there's an awful lot of information to be got from the size distribution of particles. And so certainly people like Roy Harrison in my department, he's been doing this for a long time, but using regulatory monitors. And using regulatory monitors, you can get a lot of information, you know, going down to tens of nanometers up to tens of microns. Now, you can't get to that lower size with low-cost sensors. So we can only really get to this red box type territory. But you can see there's still wiggles in the size. And so there's information of where those particles come from. And very broad brushstrokes, the smaller stuff tends to be combustion, and the bigger stuff tends to be from more mechanical processes, resuspension of dust, breakwear, things like that, construction work. And so this was a question we set ourselves a couple of years ago, wondering if we could use sensors to get information out from these size distributions. Not desperately hopeful, but I think it's fair to say we've really got a lot further than we ever thought would be possible. And so this is one example we've been working with Gordon Allison at Dustscan on. And so this is using low-cost sensors and low-cost source apportionment techniques to see if we can apportion the pollution due to a construction site and how much of the pollution at that construction site was because of the construction and how much of it was just due to air pollution you've got no control over. So this was done, HS2 were very gracious and let us work there. Dustscan had a contract there, but they allowed us to do this additional work. So the measurement site was up here. So you've got this huge construction site to the east, south, and southwest of the monitoring site. And so what the source apportionment does is it breaks down the size of particles into the different factors which make it up. And so what we have is 4 factors. First factor is a kind of urban background type signal. That size distribution, that's kind of very characteristic. The second one is a regional background. This is kind of marine signals, you know, kind of ocean type. And then we've got 2 more signals, which we, when we looked at the diaries, of where the construction work was, you can actually almost perfectly aligned. Almost perfectly aligned with when the teams were on site. So we really, these factors 3 and 4 were to do with the work at the station, at the construction site. And so now what I think is really powerful about this is you can now say, well, this much pollution was due to your construction site, this much was due to the urban background pollution, which maybe you could do something about, but it's very difficult. You know, you can turn off all the traffic, etc. And then how much of that is then different from the regional background, which you really don't have any chance of controlling. And so it gives, I think, it gives industry much more agency to say, well, that pollution is ours, and so we can do something about it. And this isn't ours, and we can't do anything about it. And likewise with regulators, I think that also offers possibilities. And so, for example, if we then look at just the fraction coming from the factor associated with the construction work, if we look at the difference between non-working and working hours, you can see it really picks it out. And again, if we look at the diaries, that worked very well. So we can do the same thing for indoors. We're going back to South Wales now. We're in the school in South Wales. So again, this is the work by Owain. Again, just reminding you what the PM1, PM2.5 and PM10 look like. And then what we can do here, which I thought was really nice work by Owain, is you can look at how much of the pollution measured indoors comes from indoor sources and how much of it comes from outdoor sources. So we're looking at the differences between classroom 1, classroom 2, and classroom 3. So if you remember, it's RE, English, and cooking. So for PM1, we can see most of it comes from outdoors. So that's the black line. You can see during the first week where it turns in, you can see there's something in indoors, but most of it is due to outdoor pollution ingressing in. If we look at PM2.5, much clearer, much bigger indoor signals during when the students are in. Interestingly, you can see within classroom 3, which is the cooking classroom, there's actually far less indoor pollution than there is outdoor pollution. And the reason behind this is actually the classrooms in 1 and 2, they have carpets, and in terms of particulate matter, carpets are horrible things. So you get that real resuspension of dust. And also the cooking classroom is less well used than the other ones. And if we look at PM10, it's really clear. So nearly all of the PM10 is because of indoor activities. So very clear. And again, in classroom 3, because of the lack of carpeting and the slightly less use, there's less pollution. You can see there's some little cooking events in there. Interestingly, you can see in classroom 2, presumably there's a hard-working teacher who's come back during half term to do some extra marking or similar. Not so much in classroom 1, but in classroom 2. And so you can really start to get lots of information out of this. And I think, again, this idea of where does the pollution come from indoors, again, that starts to give you ideas, how will we go about controlling it? So simply from this one, it could be, well, just replace your carpets with hard floors and you'll get rid of most of your pollution, PM pollution. But if you're interested in the lower sizes, then actually you're thinking more about filtration, because it's mainly coming from outdoor air inwards. And then this is back to the Celio campaign. And so this is an example of us combining multiple sensors together now. So you can start to combine, they're all particulate matter sensors at some level, but starting to bring in things like black carbon monitors, and that'll give us more information about traffic, ultrafine particle counters, that'll give us more information about nucleation events. And we can start to build up this story. So you can start to bring different sensors together to get a much more nuanced idea of what's going in here. And what we see here, this is all the trips through Celio. So what we have is latitude versus longitude versus time. So you start to build up this really dense network of measurements. And I won't go into it today because it gets into quite a lot of detail, but the really exciting thing from this actually is using machine learning techniques on top of this. Is you can start to, if you have enough people walking around with sensors, maybe 3 or 4, what you then have is enough information to then start predicting anyone's exposure who's walking through this space. So you can start doing predictions like that, which works well. Just one example from this work is, if you look at this, as you walk through Celio, actually there was quite a lot of construction going on at this point, because it was the period when students were out for the summer, and so the students were gone, so the landlords were making the properties nicer. And actually with the source apportionment, you really could start to pick out which houses were being updated and which houses had construction going on within them. So you're really getting very, very, very local information, not only on the air pollution amount, but also the sources of where they're coming from. So that hyperlocal measurements are now turning into hyperlocal source apportionment, which is satisfying. So the last example I want to show, really, before I get on to something a little bit more visual, is pollen. So again, I mentioned bioaerosols before. So pollen, very important for health. But there's not much pollen. If we compare the number of pollen particles compared to other things out there, then it really is that needle in the haystack. And this is where you need this machine learning type algorithms, but you can start to really reconstruct pollen from low-cost sensors. I won't go through all the details here because there's a lot going on, but I think what it shows is that combination of these two zeitgeisty techniques, both sensors on the one hand, but also machine learning on the other hand. You can really get kind of amazing resolution coming out. And I was quite shocked at how well it did. Machine learning really is making incredible progress here. And so that bioaerosols work is on a new project that I'm involved with on leading, this artificial intelligence for pollen and spore detection, forecasting, and human health. And not to do too much of a sell on this, but again, going back to my original point about how a lot of academic work now really wants to work with practitioners. And so if you have ideas about where you would like to know where bioaerosols, whether, if some of you are interested in indoor environments, or maybe you've got biocomposting sites, or maybe you're interested in ambient, I'd be really interested to hear about use cases, because that's exactly what academics need to make their work impactful, going back to this greater push for academia to make impact, not just to be writing our papers, etc. So the last bit I want to show you is more bit of fun, but also I think probably the most successful thing I've done over the last few years. And so this is working with this artist I mentioned at the start, so Robin Price. And so what he did was he took these sensors, so this is the OPC N3 particle sensor there on his wrist, and he came up with this, his lightsaber in essence. So this is a array of LEDs, and he's wired it up in such a way that the air pollution signal triggers the amount of lights, how much they flash. And so essentially he then does long exposure photography. So he walks across the scene taking the photograph. Sorry, he takes the long exposure photograph at the same time as someone walks across the scene with his flashing lights. And essentially, because it's long exposure photography, the only thing you see in the photograph is either things which are really bright, hence why you see the tail lights of the car going that way, or things which stay still. And so then you get the lights of the thing, and the number of lights in there represent how much pollution there is. So this was the idea of the metaphor of like a magnifying glass, being able to see how much pollution there was. So this has been super successful, and it's working around this idea of how do we make the invisible visible. And this was our idea for doing this. So we've done this around the world now. This is in Ethiopia, which is relatively good air quality. I'm sure some of you will know this as Port Talbot. So again, you've got this very, very real example of health versus wealth there. So actually quite a polluted area. So here's about 50 micrograms per meter cubed of PM2.5. Here we've got about 30 to 40 micrograms. And here we're in Delhi, which unfortunately is pretty much the most polluted city in the world. And so that's a child's playground with about 600 micrograms per meter cubed there. And so again, this is another example of, you really can use these sensors, not only for science, but really now for outreach work. Again, we wouldn't have used to take our equipment into schools, etc. But now we really can come up with clever ways of promoting science. Turns out we weren't the first people to come up with this idea. There's one of these less known artists back in time did similar work. And this has been really successful. You've seen the Guardian image that's been picked up in many things around the world. I got into the New Scientist, which was a childhood dream, into the Guardian. We got commissioned by UN Habitat for this sort of stuff. So really showing the importance of air pollution, but the importance of being able to show people where air pollution is. We're doing an event, that's Robin there. We're doing an event tonight actually in Birmingham City Centre using again the same thing. And so we turn these into postcards to inform people, but it was interesting. So we also asked people not only to say where air pollution was, what they thought was important, but we asked them who they thought should be in charge of this. So this was in Ethiopia, hence the funky Aramaic writing there. And kind of in my mind, we would send it to the people who they put down. So I had this Harry Potter-esque hope that the Prime Minister or the President would wake up in the morning with tens of thousands of postcards telling them about or her about air pollution. And so final slides, the last bit. So the Commonwealth Games was in Birmingham last year, and I was involved with a team who put in, again, one of these alpha sense particle sensors in here. So the idea behind the baton was it had the eyes, it had a video, it had the lungs, which was the air pollution sensor. And again, this baton went around the world taking the Queen's message with it. And so this was a really nice way to think about air pollution in a non-hostile way, that it wasn't an idea to name and shame people, it was to get spaces and places of discussion to talk about air pollution and climate change and how we could do it. So here's a nice image of the team presenting it to the Queen last year. I wasn't allowed to get that close. I was behind the bars. Security wouldn't let me get any closer than that. But I think that's it. So thank you ever so much for listening. It is great honour to be the honorary fellow. So thank you very much for that, and happily take any questions.
Thank you, Francis. That's fantastic. Absolutely. Seeing all the work that's been progressed, and particularly around art and bringing sort of art into science and vice versa. That's great. Derek? Are there any questions in the chat at all that have come up?
No, there's not any questions that have come in.
That's fine. Well, what I have is one question, and I'll talk around it a minute just to give you a chance to breathe, Francis. So my one kind of relates to the outcomes from everything that you're doing there in terms of how best to communicate. And I don't use sell as in trying to commercialize what you're doing, but you really want to make sure that things are taken up in terms of source apportionment and all of that side of things, so that they'll actually occur in the real world and have an outcome that then looks to improve air quality in some way. I'll use an example of, I was on a train the other day leaving central Manchester, and on the train it had been refurbed, the train, and on the inside of the train it had a little TV screen, and it flashed between an advert for something commercially, then it showed me the weather forecast for today and tomorrow, and then it also surprisingly said what the air quality is, and it just said air quality is good. And this train was traveling from the city centre of Manchester through various suburbs, past busy roads, and it didn't change all that time. It was just always telling me the air quality was good. So a big thing for me is how we communicate all of this. And I suppose, what are your thoughts around all of that work that's being done in terms of people walking around with sensors in backpacks, providing that really sort of high resolution of detail? What's the outcome from that that can then be told to, I suppose, the non-air quality layperson out there, of why they should commission this, do it, consider it, think it's important, beyond just saying it's good to see this data?
Yeah. So I think, so the dream of personalised air quality exposure measurements, so I think, so these apps are certainly good. They suck in a lot of information, but I think, so for susceptible people, so for most people, air quality is a problem. We don't want it, but we can probably take a bit of poor air quality every now and then. But there are susceptible members of public, which would do a lot better not to be in hotspots. So if you really can prevent that, that would help a lot. So I think that personalised air quality, that would help a lot. And it also, I think it comes back to that argument of the regulators. If they know this is where the hotspot is every time, then they can do something about it. But if they don't have that information, and also from the industry point of view, if they know we're creating problem at this place at this time, then that gives them the information to do something about it, right? No one wants air pollution. It's not, there's not some big evil industry out there producing it for the sake of it, right? So it's
that makes sense. What just a mini follow-up question. The classroom study, what was there any follow-up from that, or were there any sort of actions or measures taken as part of that work by the school? And also how or was it communicated at all to, I know it's always really sensitive when you've got what you tell people's parents at schools and dealing with PTAs and things like that. I suppose, how was it communicated, and was there any action taken? Probably the two.
Yeah, so certainly we told the school what we found. I mean, it was inside, so yeah, I don't think it will go to the PTA, and I was careful not to name the school either. But I don't think it was untoward. I don't think it was anything different. But it's for indoor air quality, it's striking how high the levels get to, and it's just resuspension of dust. It's nothing more complicated than that. But you get far higher exposures inside than you do outside, and as long as the composition doesn't come into it, then we don't know if it's any better or worse for you, that indoor air quality, than it is outside, right? So, but yeah, to answer your question, so we reported back to the school, and they can do with that what they want. But it was very nice of them to let Owine in there and work there. So
yeah, they need to take up their carpets, I think, is probably the
I mean I've measured in my own home, and it's exactly that. So if you look at, most of my house downstairs is hard floored, and relatively minor soft furnishings, and then as soon as you go upstairs, carpets, duvets. I mean, I'm not saying I'd get rid of my duvet or have a plastic duvet, but but yeah, it really is. It's soft furnishings where all that PM comes from.
That's great, thank you. Derek,
yes, we do have a couple of questions. So the first one's from Joe Shaw, and it says, very interesting presentation, thank you. Can you recommend any companies that provide low-cost sensors for a portable sensor that can be used for real-time occupational exposure?
I certainly can do. I guess I'm a little bit nervous naming certain companies here and now, just because I guess competitors might be in the room, and I don't want to say one out but yes, there are. I mean, feel free, Joe, to send me an email. I can certainly point you in the direction of it. But yeah, I'm a little bit uncomfortable kind of naming one where there might be 2 or 3 others just as good. So if that's not sitting on the fence too much.
Fantastic, thanks. Another question is, can you comment on the uncertainty of these sensors and to what extent calibration needs to be specific to the environment in which they are deployed?
Yeah,
and there's also
so
there's also a follow-up note as well. Also noted that CEN have published a technical specification for individual gas sensors.
Yeah. So I guess the first point to make on that is some of these sensors, and most of my work's around particles, so that's why I know much better. And some of these sensors are incredibly good, and some of the cheap sensors are incredibly good. And so yes, there's uncertainty. So the accreditation gets as far as the MCerts at the moment, and that's plus or minus 50%, which is that's huge range of uncertainty there. It's good enough to do work with, but many of these sensors are a lot better than that. You need to calibrate to the situation they're in, and usually there's a few things you have to be mindful for. So with respect to the particles, you need to know what the relative humidity is and correct for that, or at least know that the sensors have already got that happening in the algorithms. So yeah, so some of them, the uncertainty is very low. Again, I can't say specifically for each and every one. The gas sensors I know less well personally, but the mood music is still the uncertainty is a lot higher than compared to the particles. And the reason for that is well, I think the reason for that is the particle sensors are essentially tried and tested technology, miniaturized, and then you get the additional uncertainties just because the equipment is smaller, and so the uncertainties on those tolerances. Whereas the gas sensors are using different technologies to how you would measure them in the lab, and they it's much more uncertain there. But yeah, I mean, some of them are great. So some of them really are great now.
And there's just a question and a comment from Noel saying, isn't there still a question around the reliability? And the comment is, I understand NPL are doing work to advise how these may be used as single monitors or as part of network of monitors.
Yeah, so the reliability one, of course, so long-term drift is a real pain. And again, this comes back to what I was talking about earlier about the difference between CAPEX and OPEX. So essentially how much it costs to buy them up front and how much does it cost to keep using them as we go along. And long-term drift is a real killer in terms of that operational cost, because if these things are drifting, then that says you have to bring them back and calibrate some way or another, relatively often. And as soon as you've got that human element, then that operating cost increases dramatically. So that's a real pain. There's some of the manufacturers who combine these sensors have neat tricks. So Purple Air just uses 2 PM sensors next to each other. And essentially when they start disagreeing with each of these 2 sensors together, then something fishy is going on. So that's quite a nice little engineering trick for just understanding when the sensors start misbehaving, for example. So there's these tricks in there. The NPL work, I know they're working. I can speak to that specifically, but yeah, there's lots of work on that reliability issue. So I think again it's sensor specific, but some of them are very good. But yeah, calibration and that long-term drift is the bit which does push the costs up, unfortunately.
Great. That is it for the questions, Chris.
Thank you. No, thank you for that. If there's no more questions, what we'll do is we'll leave it there. Let everyone escape a little bit earlier. Oh, there's one more question that's just popped through. If you want to deal with one more, do you want to read that?
Yeah, and it's from Mark. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on what impact of forthcoming BSI PAS 4023 Code of Practice document might have on standardizing the sensors market, enabling their future use in a more regulatory and compliance setting?
Yeah, I think any regulation's got to be useful at this stage. I think one of the So not to comment on that one specifically, but any regulation at this point's got to be good. So as I said, it's not new technology. Many of these things aren't new technology. It's been going on for over a decade, probably getting close to 2 decades now. And so I think regulation will help things a lot at this point, because it's still a little bit too much like the Wild West for my liking, you know, and it's been that way for too long. So I think regulation will help a lot now.
Great, and there is a final question from Will, which I'll just read out. So it just says, "Hi Francis, thanks for the presentation. Looks as though lots of data will be collected with greater uptake of LSCs. What are your thoughts on data sharing collaboration going forward to ensure access to information?"
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the use case, right? So it depends who's using the data and what they're using it for. So if consultancy is measuring air pollution in a sensitive site, I don't see why they have to release that data to everyone. You know, it depends on the use case, but certainly, and this was something I was going to mention during the talk and I forgot to, but you know, the world is already littered with low-cost sensors and low-cost sensors networks which have had their time and are not being used. So you know, and so it's a real shame at some level, and I think that comes to my earlier point that, you know, there's been this dream and it hasn't quite been realized yet. So I think, you know, in general, releasing data where possible is great, with all the associated metadata, so you can work out what the calibration was, etc. Yeah, I've talked myself into knots a little bit here. I guess the easy answer is yes. You know, people, unless it's sensitive, then people should be releasing data. How useful that data is without the metadata is open to question. But in general, open data, I believe in. I think that's a good way of doing things. And it would maybe help in making sure that these sensors are used again and again, not that we start littering the countryside with all these old networks and sensors.
Thank you. Thanks for that. That makes sense. I mean, it'd be nice to have a central UK-wide repository for all the data that could be poured into it.
Yeah, and there's some nice examples of that. There is some nice examples of that, of people uploading their data as IAQ, and but then it's not desperately well regulated. I mean, one of the things I always think about is, you know, so meteorology at some level, like the amateur meteorologists pushed the field along miles, right? And so with air pollution, maybe we'll have that step change movement at some point where we have our amateur air pollution scientists is really what's driving the field. And so greater not regulation, but greater rigor in there would certainly be helpful.
People monitoring it in their gardens and at home would be great, never mind their schools and beyond. That's fantastic. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Francis, for fantastic presentation, and great to have you as an honorary fellow, and look forward to working together moving forward. Hopefully, like you mentioned, definitely increasing ties and sort of collaboration with academia and the IQM, which is great. So thank you. Thank you to everyone as well for all the questions and participation today. Thank you for joining. That is the end of today's and this year's AGM. Look forward to seeing you all at an IQM event soon, and please do participate, get involved, collaborate, and engage. And yeah, have a great day. Thank you again, and bye-bye.